and we'll just give it a couple of minutes because typically it takes a couple of minutes to get people to come in. I can also see that we are now live on YouTube. So for anybody interested in hopping on there and streaming it there, if that's easier for you, you can put it on your TV. You're welcome to do that. I hope everybody's enjoying their DoorDash. For those of you who were able to register for that, that's how we're doing food this year, Judge.
Yeah.
Because we can't have Chick-fil-A at the back of the classroom.
So
we're just, here's a DoorDash voucher and have you.
Oh, that's great. That's great.
Yeah. So
is the show going to be, is the streaming for of the show itself, is that tonight or tomorrow night, or how are y'all doing that?
That'll be tomorrow, I believe. I think that there's one group doing it. So I think we have that going on tomorrow night.
Good.
To follow up. So I'll get started as people zoom on in. I'll just get started with your introduction so we can get started, Judge. So thank you for joining us this evening, Texas Federalist Society. Judge Charles Eskridge, we're happy to have him tonight, is a United States District Court judge on the Southern District of Texas. He graduated from Pepperdine Law School, magna cum laude, before clerking for Judge Charles Clark of the United States Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit, and then for Justice Byron White on the Supreme Court. After clerking, Judge Eskridge entered private practice. He practiced for several decades in Houston, Texas as a partner, first at Sussman Godfrey and then at Quinn Emanuel. He's also been an adjunct professor at the University of Houston and at Pepperdine. This fall, Judge Eskridge will co-teach the same class that he's taught at Houston and Pepperdine with Judge Brantley Starr of the Northern District of Texas here at UT Law. That class is entitled Origins of the Federal Constitution. And for everyone looking at the schedule that just dropped from Academic Affairs, if you're interested, that class will satisfy your Con Law 2 credit, which is a requirement. So consider Judge Eskridge's class. It'll be great. Tonight will perhaps serve as a bit of a preview for what you can expect in the fall. Judge Eskridge took the bench in October 2019 to a more than full caseload, I might add. He's a friend of UT FedSoc, a Hamilton fan, obviously, and a talented composer in his own respect. Most recently, he wrote, planned, and put on what might be the nation's first Zoom musical, Plymouth Rocks, a 400-year anniversary celebration of the Mayflower Compact. You may know him from his duet with Judge Elrod of the Fifth Circuit, a parody of the Hamilton song, You'll Be Back. And if you haven't already seen it, no worries, I'll drop the link in the chat in a little bit. So atop all of these professional and personal accomplishments, Judge Eskridge is an excellent boss and a mentor to me, and I am honored to welcome him to speak with us this evening. So take it away, Judge.
Thank you, Seth, very much. And thanks to everybody who's here. I wish I could see you all. I also wish that we were in person. And hopefully we will be getting back to doing things in person soon. I really appreciate the invitation to do this to the University of Texas FedSoc chapter. When I originally put this together, gosh, about 4 or 5 years ago, the second time I did it was for the UT FedSoc chapter that year. I think that was 2017. And y'all always do something creative with it. I understand that there will be a screening of the original cast that's now on Disney Plus. It's amazing if you haven't seen it, so do see it. Last time I did it, whatever your a cappella singing group is, they did some pre-show entertainment. They had done some, they'd come up with their version of several of the songs, which I actually thought went really well. But let me get started here. I'm going to share my screen because I have a presentation that goes along with this that will help you follow and understand what's going on in the songs as we do it. Now, I would not necessarily say that I am obsessed with Hamilton, but I was all over the soundtrack when it came out. And then my wife noticed a Facebook meme that year and said it applied to me. My thoughts have been replaced entirely by Hamilton lyrics. And that is true. And it's not just a few lyrics, mind you. There are 20,520 words to be precise. That works out to about 140 words per minute during the show. And in Guns and Ships, at one point, Lafayette is clocking them in at 6.3 words per second. Now let's put that into perspective. Phantom of the Opera had 6,789 words. The Founding Fathers were taken on in another musical called 1776 back in the year 1969, and that had 2,735 sung words. So this show is just a little bit different. Lin-Manuel Miranda takes on the sweep of life, focused through a lens of politics. And the songs come in cycles on universal themes of ambition, love, betrayal, loss, legacy. And I'm going to try to break that down and collect that for you as we go through it this evening. So let's begin. Now, when the greatest show in Broadway history, and I believe this is, it opens with a question. That question deserves an answer. How does a bastard, orphan, son of a whore and a Scotsman dropped in the middle of a forgotten spot in the Caribbean by Providence? Listen to everything that's being stacked up against our hero in the mid-18th century. Impoverished, in squalor. How does that person grow up to be a hero and a scholar? I submit that the show answers that question with three responses, and that is the point of the show. Each of these three is a virtue, but like any great tragedy, when mixed with pride, taken to an extreme, they are the root of hubris and downfall. The first is ambition, a scrapper, born at the bottom, but yearning to make a mark. But ambition is not enough without determination, relentless pursuit of a worthy goal. But without the final key piece, education, even ambition and determination will fall short. Now, I hope that my paper was circulated to everyone in advance of this, because I do key to an original document for each of these songs as to the theme. And as to this one, education, remember, Madison was educated at Princeton, Jefferson went to William and Mary, and Hamilton was at King's College, which went on to become Columbia. We will see a real war in this show with shots fired in anger, but post-Renaissance and post-Enlightenment, it was the war of ideas, that battle, that was the real front of the war. Noah Webster discussed how to arm ourselves for that war in 1788, in the year between the drafting and ratification of the Constitution. That's the document that I've submitted. And yes, it's that Webster of our first American dictionary. He was a friend of Hamilton's, and in the 1790s, he edited New York's leading Federalist Party newspaper. Here's a quote. "But every child in America should be acquainted with his own country. He should read books that furnish him with ideas that will be useful to him in life and practice. As soon as he opens his lips, he should rehearse the history of his own country. He should lisp the praise of liberty and of those illustrious heroes and statesmen who have wrought a revolution in her favor. Here, every class of people should know and love the laws. This knowledge should be diffused by means of schools and newspapers, and an attachment to the laws may be formed by impressions early upon the mind." Now, as I said, Miranda also answers his opening question with ambition, and we'll turn fully to Mr. Burr in just a second. But Aaron Burr, Sir, introduces them both and lays bare the young Hamilton's ambition upon arrival in New York. With this song, Miranda also makes his first explicit link to actual words from an original source text. God, I wish there was a war. The letter I pair with this is Hamilton at age 14, still on the island of Nevis, already clear about the arc he had planned for his life and the source from where he thought opportunity might arise. Ned, my ambition is prevalent, that I condemn the groveling and condition of a clerk or the like, to which my fortune, etc., condemns me, and would willingly risk my life, though not my character, to exalt my station. Neddy, we have seen such schemes successful when the projector is constant, and I shall conclude saying, I wish there was a war. But it is not simply Hamilton's ambition that animates this show. It is the clash of his ambition with that of Jefferson and Madison, and most importantly, Aaron Burr. These three together are Hamilton's nemesis in Act Two. Yet a remarkable thing is that Miranda paints no one in this show as pure villain. Even Burr, who concludes the opening song with the classic line, "Me, I'm the damn fool who shot him." Even he is treated with understanding and indeed kindness. Wait For It is a later song purely about Burr's own ambition rolling into the Revolutionary War. I couldn't find many online source references directly to Burr's pen. The National Archives has only 49, compared to 7,632 for Hamilton. So take that, Burr. But this one sets the tone, and he wrote it to George Washington during the war. I would beg to know whether it was any misconduct in me or extraordinary merit or service in them which entitled the gentleman lately put over me to that preference. See, he was upset that there were younger officers, younger persons who had been promoted to higher rank before him. And so he said to George Washington, as a decent attention to rank is both proper and necessary, I hope it will be excused in one who regards his honor next to the welfare of his country. So ambitious, yes, but a little bit whiny and pushy about it. But back to song 3 and My Shot. Miranda adds determination to the education and ambition trifecta. By the song's end, we are introduced to all of our Act 1 heroes, each of whom goes on to a conflicted role in Act 2. Hercules Mulligan, our hulking tailor's apprentice and spy, who will go on to portray James Madison. The sleek Marquis de Lafayette, who goes on to be the equally smooth Thomas Jefferson. And John Laurens, Hamilton's best friend, will die before Act 1 and go on to be the equally doomed Philip Hamilton in Act 2. By the way, there are going to be slight spoilers as I go through this with you. For instance, Burr is going to kill Hamilton in a duel. It's just something that's going to happen. But you know, we're talking about events in history, actual history that happened 250 years ago. So you could have already known this if you had paid more attention in your American history class or already listened to the soundtrack. Now, My Shot also sets the shift to our next group of songs on revolution. In 1774, our founders wanted to be more English, not less. They believed themselves born to an enlightened England, deserving of all the rights of the English that they had obtained through patient struggle from Magna Carta in 1215 to the Petition of Right in 1628 to the English Bill of Rights in 1689. Now, the declaration and resolves of the First Continental Congress could not have been more direct, speaking in strong terms while trying to maintain the veneer of loyalty to the crown in October of 1774. We are entitled to life, liberty, and property, and we have never ceded to any foreign power whatever a right to dispose of either without our consent. That our ancestors who first settled these colonies were at the time of their immigration from the mother country entitled to all the rights, liberties, and immunities of free and natural born subjects within the realm of England. Now, the story of tonight would just be a classic drinking song among buddies in a bar, were it not for the message that Miranda gives to our heroes. Raise a glass to freedom, something they can never take away, no matter what they tell you. George Mason is not a character in Hamilton, but he was one of the great thinkers and orators on freedom, liberty, and our founders' belief in natural law and the principles of reason that connect them. In June of 1776, he would be the primary draftsman of the Virginia Declaration of Rights. The year before, he was already right on target and warning how difficult it is to keep the flame of liberty and freedom ablaze. He said in a speech, "We came equals into this world, and equals shall we go out of it. All men are by nature born equally free and independent. Every society, all government, every kind of civil compact, therefore, is or ought to be calculated for the general good and safety of the community. To restore mankind to its native rights has been the study of some of the best men this world has ever produced, and the most effectual means that human wisdom has ever been able to devise, is frequently appealing to the body of the people, to those constituent members from whom authority originated for their approbation or dissent. The history of all nations who have had liberty and lost it put these facts beyond doubt." And with our heroes properly introduced, it is time to meet our heroines in the time of revolution, the Schuyler sisters, Angelica, Eliza, and if you've seen the show, and Peggy. Their songs note the different treatment of men and women in these times. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. When I meet Thomas Jefferson, I'm going to compel him to include women in the sequel. Work. Now, Miranda paid attention to not just this disparity, but again and again to slavery and the unjust treatment of Blacks in America. 3 months before the Declaration of Independence, Abigail Adams also gave a healthy earful to her husband, John Adams. She wrote, "I long to hear that you've declared an independency. And by the way, in the new code of laws, which I suppose it will be necessary for you to make, I desire that you would remember the ladies and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors. Remember, all men would be tyrants if they could." Song 6 is titled "Farmer Refuted," and it sources literally to a political tract that Hamilton brought to prominence at the age of 20. The elaborate title of my speech today is homage to Hamilton's own full title. The farmer had argued that loyalty and patient submission were the colony's only option. Hamilton exploded that notion with "The Farmer Refuted," which itself provides a basis and structure for the aspirations of the preamble. It has long been the 5th document that I teach in my class on origins of the federal Constitution, and it is a lengthy address. The sweep and scope of thinking and the absolute confidence with which it's asserted at the age of 20 is profound. And it also makes clear why our man is going to meet his ultimate fate in a duel, because when Hamilton sets pen to paper, he shows no mercy. Here's how he opens it. "The spirit that breathes through your letter is so rancorous, illiberal, imperious. The argumentative part of it so puerile and fallacious. The misrepresentations of fact so palpable and flagrant. The criticisms so illiterate, trifling, and absurd. The conceits so low, sterile, and splenetic that I will venture to pronounce it one of the most ludicrous performances which has been exhibited to public view during all the present controversy." Now, of course, many of you listening in today think of yourselves as natural geniuses. Perhaps you are, but again, I just remind you, this is Hamilton, already several years younger than each of you are now. But the last of the Songs of Revolution is the first of 3 appearances by King George III. Each time, all alone, he takes center stage and genuinely commands the audience. You'll Be Back is kind of a vampy, glam breakup song, petulant sorrow, at being spurned by his colonies that must now be compelled to love him. He's kind of like a creepy global stalker in the centuries before Facebook. Now, not everyone in England agreed with King George's view. And so I pair this song with Edmund Burke's famous speech to Parliament titled On Conciliation with the Colonies. Burke proves various reasons why what he calls a fierce spirit of liberty has grown up in the colonies, including descent with ancestry linked to English rights, form of government with representation in Parliament, religion with respect for rule of law, education, and in particular, education in the law, and remoteness of our situation. We've been on our own, taking care of ourselves for well over 100 years. Taking note of this flame that is ready to consume us, Burke notes the real question at hand. I do not commend either the spirit in this excess or the moral causes which produce it. The question is not whether their spirit deserves praise or blame, but what in the name of God shall we do with it? And King George in the song provides his ready retort, I will send a fully armed battalion to remind you of my love. This takes us to a first cycle of songs in the Revolutionary War itself on themes of struggle and deprivation. It is at this point that we meet the general, George Washington, in Right Hand Man. He enters racked in self-doubt, and yet the consummate leader, aware that the weight of the war and a new way of life rests on his shoulders. He sings, can I let down my guard and tell the people how I feel a second? The elephant is in the room. The truth is in your face when you hear the British cannons go boom. In My Shot, Miranda has Hamilton sing, this is not a moment, it's the movement. But in 1783, at the verge of ultimate success in the war, Washington sent what was called the Circular to the States. That, he said, was the moment to claim the real prize for which we'd been fighting. He wrote, when we consider the magnitude of the prize we contended for, the doubtful nature of the contest, and the favorable manner in which it has terminated, we shall find the greatest possible reason for gratitude and rejoicing. The foundation of our empire was not laid in the gloomy age of ignorance and superstition, but at an epoch when the rights of mankind were better understood and more clearly defined than at any former period. At this auspicious period, the United States came into existence as a nation, and if their citizens should not be completely free and happy, the fault shall be entirely their own. Now, let's jump to Song 14 to see what Washington meant by the doubtful nature of the contest. Stay Alive is a song of the suffering and sacrifice through that long winter at Valley Forge. A harsh winter, no clothes, no food. In the song, Washington sings, the cavalry's not coming, and Hamilton pens, we have resorted to eating our horses. In Washington's plea to Congress for aid, he, through Hamilton, who's the one with the pen, warns of suffering and starvation and the fear of mutiny and ultimate loss. He writes, for some days past, there has been little less than a famine in camp. A part of the army has been a week without any kind of flesh, and the rest 3 or 4 days. Naked and starving as they are, we cannot enough admire the incomparable patience and fidelity of the soldiery, that they have not been, for this, excited by their sufferings to a general mutiny and dispersion. Strong symptoms, however, of discontent have appeared in particular instances, and nothing but the most active efforts everywhere can long avert so shocking a catastrophe. Now, our forces endure a string of losses, or at best stalemates, and a loss of confidence. With 10 dual commandments, General Charles Lee fails at the Battle of Monmouth and is replaced by the Marquis de Lafayette. And Lee starts talking smack about Washington. John Laurens steps up with Hamilton as his second for the duel. Burr serves as Lees in the show. That's dramatic license to put Burr and Hamilton together on the dueling ground in Act 1, where they will meet again at the conclusion of Act 2. But the song sets out 10 rules for duels. There was apparently an 11th. The seconds will agree to a narrative of what is called an affair of honor. The circumstances will be explained as voluntary conduct among gentlemen, and so hopefully no charge of murder will issue regardless of outcome. I include the narrative penned by Alexander Hamilton and Major Edwards. There is one for the Hamilton-Burr affair as well, written 25 years later by their seconds, if you care to search it out. Now, already by this point, amidst the struggles of the Revolutionary War, with Song 12, Hamilton chafes at being sidelined from the action. He is Washington's right-hand man, true. So in that sense, he's not thrown away his shot, so to speak. But he still wants to be in that war that he wished for as a child on Nevis. Hamilton tells Burr, "I wish I had your command instead of manning George's journal." And in a letter to General Philip Schuyler, who by February 1781 would be Hamilton's father-in-law, Hamilton writes, "I always disliked the office of an aide-de-camp as having in it a kind of personal dependence. Ambition and determination always. And it sets up the conflict between Washington and himself." With Song 16, Meet Me Inside, Hamilton's need to be his own man, to earn his own place and level of respect, comes between him and Washington. Now, Miranda places that break dramatically as the result of the Laurens-Lee duel. The actual history didn't have quite the same flair, but Hamilton does recount it with a bit of overwrought drama as an inadequate showing of mutual respect. Hamilton writes, "The great man and I have come to an open rupture. Proposals of accommodation have been made on his part, but rejected. Without a shadow of reason and on the slightest ground, he charged me in the most affrontive manner with treating him with disrespect. I answered very decisively, 'Sir, I'm not conscious of it, but since you have thought it necessary to tell me so, we part.' And so he left, at least for a time." But amidst the war, we have an interval. Young men are in combat, but another cycle of songs rises on love. In A Winter's Ball, Burr is jealous of Hamilton's ascendancy, but he's smart enough to ask, "What do we have in common? We are reliable with the ladies." By 1779, John Laurens had actually decamped to fight the war in South Carolina. Hamilton sent the included letter that I gave you, deputizing Laurens to find him a wife, one that shows the depths of their friendship, and also perhaps more than a hint that Hamilton will prove to be a difficult husband. He writes, "In politics, I'm indifferent what side she may be of. I think I have arguments that will easily convert her to mine. As to religion, a moderate stock will satisfy me. She must believe in God and hate a saint. But as to fortune, the larger stock of that, the better." But amidst the Winter's Ball, Hamilton meets the two great loves of his life, Elizabeth and Angelica Schuyler, both daughters of the great general and later New York Senator Philip Schuyler. In a later song, deep in Act 2, Eliza recounts the power of Hamilton's love letters to her. "Your sentences left me defenseless. You built me palaces out of paragraphs." And he did indeed. One of his letters to her concludes, "My heart overflows with everything for you that admiration, esteem, and love can inspire. I would this moment give the world to be near you only to kiss your sweet hand. Believe what I say to be truth, and imagine what are my feelings when I say it. Let it awake your sympathy, and let our hearts melt in a prayer to be soon united, never more to be separated." So we all need to step up our game in the love letters that we send. But we also have Hamilton's intellectual kinship with Angelica. She serves as the perfect complement for Hamilton's ambition and gives him a confidant throughout the show. The letter I've included is of no real import, apart from a conclusion which shows their affinity. I have a great opinion of your discernment, and therefore I venture to rant. If you read this letter in a certain mood, you will easily define that in which I write it. So, Wu having been successfully pitched, the Revolutionary War remains to be won. And our songs of war move on to a theme of victory. By the end of Guns and Ships, Washington has brought Hamilton back into the fold, given Hamilton his shot at command and glory. But before this, history has brought Washington and Lafayette and the colonies in France together in the fight for independence. The first letter I pair is just one to show the genuine admiration Washington has for his new friend, Lafayette, with what Washington calls his attention to the cause of liberty. But the meaning of the second letter cannot be mistaken. Washington says, the arrival of the Marquis de Lafayette opens a prospect which offers the most important advantages to these states if proper measures are adopted to improve it. He announces an intention of his court to send a fleet and army to cooperate effectually with us. An army and a fleet, guns, and the song goes guns and ships, and so the balance shifts. Again and again, Miranda links a historical turn of phrase to the ideas that animate these songs. And you will see it in History Has Its Eyes on You. It is a deceptively simple song. It's actually perhaps my favorite of the entire show. It sums up all that was George Washington and why, in my estimation, he is the single irreplaceable founder of what America would become. Ambitious, but not personally ambitious. He laid down power 3 times where any other would have seized it or kept it. At the conclusion of the Revolutionary War, returning his sword to Congress. On the collapse of the Articles of Confederation, leading efforts at the Constitutional Convention so that he is not simply named king. And after 8 years as president, peacefully turning over power to the people and to their next chief executive, which he was not required to do by the Constitution at the time. He sings, let me tell you what I wish I'd known when I was young and dreamed of glory. You have no control, who lives, who dies, who tells your story. We will return to that line with the show's final song. I present it here with Washington's general orders to the troops, 2 days before the Declaration of Independence is signed. And I say it is a war speech that rivals William Shakespeare in Henry V before the Battle of Agincourt, or Mel Gibson in Braveheart before the battle at Stirling Bridge, or even John Belushi in Animal House before the homecoming car parade. Washington says, the fate of unborn millions will now depend under God on the courage and conduct of this army. Our cruel and unrelenting enemy leaves us no choice but a brave resistance or the most abject submission. This is all we can expect. We have therefore to resolve to conquer or die. The general commands to the officers great coolness in time of action, and to the soldiers a strict attention and obedience with a becoming firmness and spirit. And finally, victory at the Battle of Yorktown when the world turned upside down. I set out letters that are the journal entries from Hamilton and Washington at the conclusion of the difficult siege waged from June to October of 1781. The words simply can't do justice to what a showstopper this song is. Hope that you've seen it streamed. Be watching for it when it happens. Hamilton writes to Lafayette following Yorktown, the rapidity and immediate success of the assault are the best comment on the behavior of the troops. And Washington says, to this, he, the General Cornwallis, was answered that a desire to spare further effusion of blood would readily incline me to treat of the surrender of the above posts, but previous to the meeting of the commissioners, I wish to have his proposals in writing, and for this purpose would grant a cessation of hostilities for 2 hours. Which was granted and which turned the tide. But as so often with turns of event in this show, with great victory comes bitter loss. John Laurens is cut down in his home state of South Carolina in one of the final skirmishes of the war. It is said that Hamilton wrote just once of the death of his dear friend and never again. He said, I feel the deepest affliction at the news we have just received of the loss of our dear and inestimable friend, Laurens. His career of virtue is at an end. The world will feel the loss of a man who has left few like him behind, and America of a citizen whose heart realized that patriotism of which others only talk. I feel the loss of a friend I truly and most tenderly loved, and one of a very few number. But with the war won, King George again stalks center stage to ask what comes next, and to signal our next big transition to songs of creation. He sings, do you have a clue what happens now? And it turns out we didn't. The Articles of Confederation loosely amalgamated the newly freed states, and they were a speedy and abject failure precisely because we lacked an energetic national government. No chief officer, no supreme judicial body, essentially no ability to take action without unanimity among all the states, and good luck with that. Here's where we begin to take a look at several of the Federalist Papers. To establish the need for the new government required absolute proof of the impending collapse of the current government. And on that score, Hamilton delivers in Federalist number 15. We may indeed with propriety be said to have reached almost the last stage of national humiliation. There's scarcely anything that can wound the pride or degrade the character of an independent nation which we do not experience. This is the melancholy situation to which we've been brought by those very maxims and counsels which would now deter us from adopting the proposed Constitution, and which, not content with having conducted us to the brink of a precipice, seem resolved to plunge us into the abyss that awaits us below. Here, my countrymen, impelled by every motive that ought to influence an enlightened people, let us make a firm stand for our safety, our tranquility, our dignity, and our reputation. After independence, difficult work laid ahead. Miranda reduces this task to very human terms with the birth of Burr's eldest daughter and Hamilton's eldest son in Dear Theodosia. A perfect lullaby, it provides a metaphor for the birth of our new country. If we lay a strong enough foundation, we'll pass it on to you, we'll give the world to you, and you'll blow us all away. The reason that the Federalist Papers are so persuasive is because Hamilton never soft-pedaled or nuanced his intent. He declared it in the plainest terms, knowing that he and his fellow framers were creating an entirely new form of government, which had to be adaptable to the exigencies in the hands of later, hopefully trusted representatives of the people. In Federalist number 34, he gives flight to that vision. In pursuing this inquiry, we must bear in mind that we are not to confine our view to the present period, but to look forward to remote futurity. Constitutions of civil government are not to be framed upon a calculation of existing exigencies, but upon a combination of these with the probable exigencies of ages according to the natural and tried course of human affairs. There ought to be capacity to provide for future contingencies as they may happen, and as they are illimitable in their nature, it is impossible safely to limit that capacity. Jumping back to Song 17, in the midst of the war and Hamilton's break with Washington, Hamilton was already mapping out what this new government needed to be and be able to do. That Would Be Enough is actually Eliza's great love song to Hamilton in the show. And within it, she understands the man that she has married. She sings, I don't pretend to know the challenges you're facing, the worlds you keep erasing and creating in your mind. All the way back in 1780, with a lengthy letter to a friend in the Continental Congress, Alexander Hamilton outlined the defects in the conduct of the war by the government and foresaw the solution. He writes at the conclusion of a 30-page letter, I have only skimmed the surface of the different subjects I have introduced. Should the plans recommended come into contemplation in earnest and you desire my further thoughts, I will endeavor to give them more form and particularity. If a convention is called, the minds of all states and the people ought to be prepared to receive its determination by sensible and popular writings, which should conform to the views of Congress. There are epochs in human affairs when novelty even is useful. 1780, he is suggesting there will need to be a convention, and he is suggesting there will need to be a writing campaign to get it adopted. He remembered these lessons and he taught them well 7 years later in 1787. With Song 24, we have the Constitutional Convention itself and the Federalist Papers. Nonstop brings down the curtain on Act 1, another showstopper. For reference, I simply pair it with the opening passage from Hamilton in the Federalist number 1 and his closing words in the final paper, number 85. But the song says the man is nonstop. Miranda says that of Hamilton many times for good reason. The Federalist Papers are not simple reads. They are works of unrelenting political genius. And note this about them. The Constitutional Convention ended on September 17th, 1787. Hamilton published Federalist number 1 on October 27th, barely a month later. Then in November, he published on the 14th, 17th, 20th, 21st, 24th, 27th, and 28th. And then on December 1, 4, 5, 12, 14, 18, 19, 21, 22, 25, 26, and 28. That's 20. Then he published another 31 papers before May 28th of 1788. If New York, the center of trade and commerce, had said no, the Union would have failed, with the United States split geographically in half. Hamilton engineered the Federalist Papers to deliver that vote. And in July of 1788, the New York delegates ratified by a count of 30 to 27, a 3-vote margin, nonstop. Another moment which is decisive in the founding of the country. Now, the last of our songs of creation begins or brings Thomas Jefferson home in the first song of Act 2. He asks, what did I miss while he was away as minister to France? Now, Jefferson was not at the Constitutional Convention, but he followed the work in close communication with his protege and ally, James Madison. The first of the letters I pair with this is from Jefferson to Madison, setting out his approval but concern with the new Constitution. I will now add what I do not like. First, the omission of a Bill of Rights, providing clearly without the aid of sophisms for freedom of religion, freedom of the press, protection against standing armies, and so on. Let me add that a Bill of Rights is what the people are entitled to against every government on earth, general or particular, and what no just government should refuse or rest on inference. The second is to another friend of his, where he sets out his hope that the Constitution would be quickly ratified, but then immediately amended to include the Bill of Rights. By a Declaration of Rights, I mean one which shall stipulate freedom of religion, freedom of the press, freedom of commerce against monopolies, trial by juries in all cases, no suspensions of habeas corpus, no standing armies. These are fetters against doing evil, which no honest government should decline. And James Madison, in fact, led the first Congress to do just that. With this, we move into a first cycle on politics, on a theme of aspiration during the Washington years. Okay, it's amazing enough that two major songs in a Broadway musical enact serious policy debates at our founding. And these are not the theatrical equivalent of setting C-SPAN clips to music. These songs are swaggering, trash-talking rap battles between Hamilton and his nemesis, Jefferson. With Cabinet Battle 1, Miranda literally sets to music their competing views on the constitutionality of establishing a national bank. In my class on origins, we read their competing letters to Washington to consider what actually was the effective limits on the necessary and proper clause and the boundaries on Congress to stay within its enumerated powers. Hamilton won the debate in terms later adopted by John Marshall in McCulloch versus Maryland. If the end be clearly comprehended with any of the specified powers, and if the measure have an obvious relation to that end and is not forbidden by any particular provision of the Constitution, it may safely be deemed to come within the compass of the national authority. What's more, the federal government with this assumed the debts, the war debts of the states. That was the reason, which meant that the wealthy who had loaned their money to their states to fight the Revolutionary War now had to rely on the national government to repay those debts. Suddenly, the most powerful in the country had a vested interest in wanting this new government to succeed. So with the Federalist Papers, Hamilton put the Constitution on its feet with a fighting chance. And with his new financial system, he gave it the means to endure. Jumping ahead for a moment to Cabinet Battle number 2, we see the great debate that consumed much of Washington's second term. This concerned what was known as the quasi-war between England and France. France by treaty gave us crucial support in our Revolutionary War, but the horrors of the guillotine were not lost on Americans. On the other hand, how much could we trust and ally with England? Washington determined to follow a course of neutrality and avoid any entangling alliance. Hamilton defended this position under the pseudonym Pacificus, a disciple of St. Francis of Assisi and evoking peace. Jefferson dragooned Madison into replying as Helvidius, a Roman writer who engaged in a heretical debate, just as Jefferson and Madison saw Hamilton's expansive view of executive power as heretical to the Constitution. And so barely 6 years after they joined their pens as Publius and the Federalist, they now pitted their eloquence against one another. From Hamilton, he wrote, "If the legislature have a right to make war on the one hand, it is on the other the duty of the executive to preserve peace till war is declared." And from Madison, "If there be a principle that ought not to be questioned within the United States, it is that every nation has a right to abolish an old government and establish a new one." Now, I, for one, would have been happy for this show to have run to 4.5, maybe even 5 hours. But Lin-Manuel Miranda didn't have room for everything that he wanted to do. Oh, well. But it's not as if he shied away from the topic of slavery. It's there in the opening song and in My Shot and Yorktown and even in Cabinet Battle number 1. But he specifically toyed with the idea of a third cabinet battle devoted to the topic of slavery. Even though that debate on slavery hit the cutting room floor, he published the lyrics. But the larger point really is this. This entire show, by its casting of mixed races to play all of our very white founders, spotlights an obvious problem and inconsistency. Because all of these faces, all of these talented individuals you now see on your screen, these persons, they would have been born slaves, obviously, had we not determined finally to set a different course. The compromise to secure entry of all 13 states into the new Constitution also imparted a painful lesson that although history will set straight the path, it should always be today's task. George Mason expressly recognized this at the convention itself. Madison, with his notes, takes this down from his speech. Every master of slaves is born a petty tyrant. They bring the judgment of heaven on a country. As nations cannot be rewarded or punished in the next world, they must be in this. By an inevitable chain of causes and effects, providence punishes national sins by national calamities. Song 27 returns us to the policy debates in Washington's first term. Jefferson and Madison were trying to keep power closer to the states, and insinuations began creeping out that Hamilton, with his expansive view of national power, actually favored an American monarchy. And even as I say that, I always wonder, how is this not the dorkiest show of all time? But it's not. It sets up an important and compelling conflict in the show. Take a Break has Hamilton equate his plight to that of Macbeth. And we begin to see Hamilton's great learning turn a bit to paranoia and conspiracy. Because during that time, he writes to a friend, "It was not till the last session that I became unequivocally convinced of the following truth, that Mr. Madison, cooperating with Mr. Jefferson, is at the head of a faction decidedly hostile to me and my administration." My administration, Hamilton writes, in service of George Washington, "and actuated by views, in my judgment, subversive of the principles of good government and dangerous to the union, peace, and happiness of the country." But it's not just Hamilton that becomes a bit paranoid about the competition between himself and Jefferson. It's there for Jefferson too. In Song 32, he frets, "It must be nice to have Washington on your side." And the divisions within the cabinet were plain to all. He sings, "Every action has its equal opposite reactions. Thanks to Hamilton, our cabinet's fractured into factions." Jefferson looked back on this after his own presidency and evoked the spirit of Washington's cabinet that Miranda captured so well via his rap battles. He wrote in 1810, "In these discussions, Hamilton and myself were daily pitted in the cabinet like two cocks. We were then but four in number, and according to the majority, which of course was 3-1, the president decided. The pain was for Hamilton and myself, but the public experienced no inconvenience." Favor, esteem, power, and control. The room where it happens is about the art of political compromise and who gets to participate in the decision. Thematically, Miranda sets up resentment by Burr that Hamilton keeps on keeping him out of that room. But historically, the song deals with what's known as the Compromise of 1790. Hamilton got his national bank approved, but at the same time, he gave the capital city essentially to Virginia with the support of the two Virginians, Jefferson and Madison. During the ratification debates, the concept of a seat of government for the new national government came with a colorful warning from one of the anti-federalists. "It shall come to be," he warned, "where all the drones in society are to be collected to feed on the honey of the land. How dangerous this city may be and what its operation on the general liberties of this country, time alone must discover. But I pray God it may not prove to this Western world what the city of Rome, enjoying a similar constitution, did to the Western." The Anti-Federalists predicted an overall centralization and domination of the new national government, by the new national government. But without being able to offer a plausible alternative to the new Constitution, they lost the overall debate. And fortunately, no concerns in that regard have ever come to pass. Now, Schuyler Defeated is a brief song about the rise of the two-party system in American politics and the fact that Aaron Burr used it to depose Hamilton's father-in-law as a senator from New York. Unlike Burr, Schuyler was a celebrated general in the Revolutionary War. Apart from laying bare Burr's naked political ambition, it showed that in the battle of ideas, the best man may not always prevail. Madison warned even in the Federalist itself of the dangers of faction and party. I've excerpted some of his famous Federalist number 10, which warns of the dangers of faction. And even today, we project a vain hope that the dangers of excesses in this regard will abate, but they never do, or at least seemingly they never do for long. One Last Time marks the exit of George Washington from the stage. The song is nothing other than the drafting and delivery of Washington's farewell address, and it's yet still another showstopper. Now, we know as students of history that it is one of the classic political statements of all time. And we know as well that Hamilton's pen took the first draft. How far I have succeeded, you will judge, Hamilton writes to Washington in his transmittal letter. In the show, the final two paragraphs of his letter are literally sung through by Hamilton first until joined by and overtaken to the finale by Washington. I anticipate with pleasing expectation that retreat in which I promise myself to realize without alloy the sweet enjoyment of partaking in the midst of my fellow citizens, the benign influence of good laws under a free government, the ever favorite object of my heart, and the happy reward, as I trust, of our mutual cares, labors, and dangers. One last time, and George Washington is going home. With Washington's exit, a new but never seen president rises, John Adams, or as we've come to know him, Paul Giamatti. And really, if you haven't seen the HBO miniseries on John Adams, do check it out while we're still, well, I guess we're not really on modified quarantine lockdown anymore, but it's worth the stream. In fact, the depiction of the smallpox plague in the late 1770s in episode 2 of John Adams is now an interesting point of comparison with COVID-19 in 2020 and 21. Adams comes in for no love in this show, and King George positively disses him, evoking a classic scene from the John Adams miniseries. That's that little guy who spoke to me all those years ago. But in fairness, John Adams' light should shine a little. He was a man of strong ideas and great principle. He was a key mover of the Declaration of Independence and Constitution. First and foremost, he was a lawyer. And I think we can revere his belief in the rule of law. He wrote something called A Defense of the Constitutions of Government of the United States in 1787, in which he said, "It is the laws alone that really love the country, the public, the whole better than any part. And that form of government which unites all the virtue, honor, and fear of the citizens in a reverence and obedience to the laws is the only one in which liberty can be secure. That is the government for which we plead." With this, we are on to another cycle of political songs on a theme of betrayal. Adams and Hamilton were both Federalists and should have been natural allies against Jefferson and Madison, but they weren't. The quasi-war between England and France led Adams to back the Alien and Sedition Acts of 1798. Hamilton, the immigrant, disapproved. They determined to take each other down politically. Who won? Well, as Burr sang in an earlier song, now Hamilton's skill with the quill is undeniable. Hamilton's tract against Adams going into the election of 1800 was a screed, hauling out slights accumulated over decades. Hamilton by 1800 was at a bitter point. Let's catch up on some earlier songs to understand why. Hamilton's downfall traces back to Song 28, earlier in Act 2, to the summer of 1792 and his affair with Maria Reynolds. James Reynolds, her husband, learned of the affair. Reynolds was involved in land speculation with other acquaintances of Hamilton. An unsavory character, he then blackmailed Hamilton. The affair and Hamilton's concealed payments were found out almost immediately. But it was James Monroe, not Aaron Burr as in the show, who confronted Hamilton about this that same year. Hamilton proved to Monroe the nature of the payments, that they were not embezzled public funds to settle land losses, but blackmail for silence on a personal matter from personal funds. Hamilton hoped it was all behind him, but it was not. And to understand that reckoning, I pair this with a letter that Hamilton wrote Eliza 12 years earlier in the midst of the Revolutionary War while they were courting. Pardon me, my love, for talking politics to you. I was once determined to let my existence and American liberty end together. My Eliza has given me a motive to outlive my pride. I had almost said my honor, but America must not be witness to my disgrace. But with Song 37 and We Know, we see the plot unfold to keep Hamilton from ever advancing to the presidency. Leaked to the chattering class are Hamilton's concealment payments, which demand explanation. Hamilton was confronted by Jefferson, Madison, and Monroe, Virginians who would go on to be the third, fourth, and fifth presidents of the United States over the next 24 years. That is an effective leak. In the show, of course, it's Burr standing in with Jefferson and Madison. Historically, though, it was Monroe. And as his caustic letter shows to Hamilton, there was no love lost between them. And a duel between them was only very narrowly averted. Monroe wrote, "It was never our intention other than to fulfill our duty to the public and our inquiry into your conduct, and with delicacy and propriety to yourself, nor have we done otherwise. Whether the imputations against you are as to speculation, whether that's well or ill-founded, depends upon the facts and circumstances which appear against you, and upon your defense. If you show that they are ill-founded, I shall be contented, for I have never undertaken to accuse you since our interview, nor do I now give my opinion on it, reserving to myself the liberty to form one after I see your defense." This forces Hamilton on the choice of not whether, but which disgrace to endure: speculation and corruption in the office of Treasury Secretary, or pinning the scarlet A to his own lapel. Miranda uses the lyrical metaphor of the hurricane that destroyed the island of Nevis in his childhood, where Hamilton was born. Hamilton, at age 17, wrote an account of the hurricane that was picked up in newspapers around the world, and which eventually got him out of Nevis and to New York. He wrote, "Good God, what horror and destruction. It seemed as if a total dissolution of nature was taking place. The roaring of the sea and wind, fiery meteors flying about it in the air, the prodigious glare of almost perpetual lightning, the crash of the falling houses, and the ear-piercing shrieks of the distressed. It was sufficient to strike astonishment into angels. In a word, misery in all its most hideous shapes spread over the whole face of the country." Miranda returns Hamilton to that point, connecting it all to Hamilton's ability to write and to persuade and to thus win the battle of ideas. Revolutionary writings, love letters to Eliza. His advice was read constantly and don't do much else. Good advice. I think it's little writings like this, though, by Hamilton that humanize him, make him relatable. For it's the kind of school contract that I have reached with my own kids to this day. Not that they always follow them, but it's still good to have the contract in writing. But Philip is lost. And even with all that Hamilton has overcome and withstood in his life, it is Philip's death that he calls an event beyond comparison, the most afflicting of my life. And that is a portrait of Philip there on the screen. Hamilton was comforted in his grief by his good friend, Benjamin Rush. Rush was the Surgeon General of the Continental Army, a signer of the Declaration, and a leader at his state's ratification convention. Hamilton writes, My loss is great indeed. The highest as well as the eldest hope of my family has been taken from me. You estimated him rightly. He was a truly fine youth. Cling. Under its banners, bona fide, must we combat our political foes, rejecting all changes, but through the channel itself provides for amendments. Now, the final song of loss is one for Aaron Burr. His loss to Jefferson for the presidency hastens the beginning of the end of his political career. Let's just leave it that before the 12th Amendment, there was the theoretical potential for a tie. And with Adams losing decisively, a tie is what occurred. That's actually the tally sheet there on your screen of the College of Electors. This meant a runoff between Jefferson and Burr in the House of Representatives. To Jefferson's shock, Burr set out to win that vote. And that's where it got strange. The House was still composed of a majority of lame duck Federalists, the party of Adams and Hamilton. And so they sing, "Dear Mr. Hamilton, your fellow Federalists would like to know how you'll be voting." Hamilton chose Jefferson. They disagreed on many things of fundamental policy, but not on matters of principle. Hamilton trusted Jefferson, believing that Jefferson believed in the nation and wanted a lasting future for the Constitution. Hamilton's was a massive takedown of Burr, indicting him as deficient in honesty, too happy to seize power, unlikely to relinquish it, and apt to abuse it when held. That's the document I've paired. And he says, "From a thorough knowledge of the character, I can pronounce with confidence that Mr. Burr is the last man in the United States to be supported by the Federalists. No, let the Federalists vote for Jefferson." Now, the show proceeds immediately to the duel, but the historical fact is Hamilton did it to Burr again in 1804. Jefferson dropped Burr from the ticket, and Burr announced as governor of New York. In that bitter smear campaign, Hamilton stated Burr to be a dangerous man and one who ought not to be trusted with the reins of government. This provoked the series of letters that Miranda sends literally flying between Burr and Hamilton on stage. Burr demands a disavowal, receives none, challenges a duel, and Hamilton accepts. Hamilton left the attached statement of his motives, should he not survive. Miranda, remember, gave flight to Hamilton's ambition with the line, "I am not throwing away my shot." Perhaps Miranda drew inspiration from this very missive, one of Hamilton's last, for that repeating line and metaphor in the show. For the letter itself brings us full circle to the sad end of Hamilton's life, where in it he writes, "I have resolved, if our interview is conducted in the usual manner, and it pleases God to give me the opportunity, to reserve and throw away my first fire. And I have pause and reflect." Hamilton and Burr closed their letters with the usual formality of the day. "I have the honor to be your obedient servant." But Hamilton also left another letter that morning for Eliza, closed with a variation he always used for her. "This letter, my very dear Eliza, will not be delivered to you unless I shall have first terminated my earthly career, to begin, as I humbly hope, from redeeming grace and divine mercy, a happy immortality. With my last idea, I shall cherish the sweet hope of meeting you in a better world. Adieu, best of wives and best of women. Embrace all my darling children for me." And as we know, this letter was delivered later that day to Eliza. And with that, we are on to the final cycle of songs, songs of legacy. As the bullet flies towards Hamilton, time stops in the show. He reflects on the nature of his legacy, still in rhyme, but more in the form of free association. Legacy. What is a legacy? It's planting seeds in a garden you never get to see. I wrote some notes at the beginning of a song someone will sing for me. America, you great unfinished symphony you sent for me. I think the speech National Greatness in 1800 captures it. It's by Gouverneur Morris. He was one of Hamilton's close friends. He also, of course, has the coolest names of any of the framers. He's credited with the drafting of the preamble and speaking strongly there at the convention against slavery, calling it a nefarious institution and the curse of heaven on the states where it prevailed. He was on the committee of style that reduced the convention debates to a first draft. He was an early senator from New York when he wrote this speech. And he said, "We are close to the source, to the true source and principle of national greatness. It is in the national spirit. It is in that high, haughty, generous, and noble spirit which prizes glory more than wealth and holds honor dearer than life. It is that spirit, the inspiring soul of heroes, which raises men above the level of humanity. When this spirit prevails, the government, whatever its form, will be wise and energetic, because such government alone will be borne by such persons. I anticipate the day when, to command respect in the remotest regions, it will be sufficient simply to say, I am an American." The final song opens, "Every other founding father story gets told. Every other founding father gets to grow old. And when you're gone, who remembers your name, who keeps your flame, who tells your story?" Hamilton wrote to his friend Gouverneur Morris 2 years before the fatal encounter with Burr. Hamilton understood all that he had created. He realized all that he had lost, and he knew the hard feelings that he had left in his turbulent wake. "Mine is an odd destiny. Perhaps no man in the United States has sacrificed or done more for the present Constitution than myself, and contrary to all my anticipations of its fate. As you know from the beginning, I am still laboring to prop the frail and worthless fabric. Yet I have the murmurs of its friends no less than the curses of its foes for my rewards. What can I do better than withdraw from the scene? Every day proves to me more and more that this American world was not made for me." Who lives, who dies, who tells your story? In that opening question of the very first song, Miranda references divine providence and stacks very long odds against Hamilton. Perhaps it was Providence that saw Lin-Manuel Miranda grab a copy of Ron Chernow's biography of Hamilton as he left for vacation in 2008, trying to figure out a worthy follow-up to the Tony that he had just won for his first musical, In the Heights. But this we know, the story of genius in the hands of genius has rarely been told so well. And now it has been told in such a way that Hamilton, the man and the musical, will never be forgotten. Thank you very much. I've enjoyed being here with you. I wish that we were together in person. Seth, should I take this off of share screen?
I think it's fine. We're gonna close out pretty quickly. Thank you so much again, Judge, for being with us. We look forward to being in person with you in the fall, hopefully.
Yes.
I'm sure we'll read quite a few things by Alexander Hamilton. So this is a prelude to that. We appreciate your time, and thank you all for attending this evening. We'll be back next Thursday.
If anyone would like to reach out to me with questions, you can find, Seth has my email, but I'd be happy to hear from any of you. Thank you for being here.
Thanks again, Judge, and thanks for coming.